Welcome to, I think it's the third session, was the official name of that session. So we'll start with Mark here, who's from Google, and be talking some more about verification.
So, about verification. Developing verified programs is still extraordinarily more expensive than normal software development. So what should we bother verifying? What are the strategic things to spend our precious verification effort on? We need to pick our battles. In order to pick our battles well, we need a map. I'm going to focus on using verification to lower our risk, and I'm going to use the attack surface as a way to visualize risk, as a way to think about where our risk is and how we can reduce it. Well, expected risk is just the flip side of expected value. Expected risk is the likelihood, the sum over all the potential exploitable vulnerabilities of the likelihood of the exploitable vulnerability and multiplied by the potential damage that would happen if the vulnerability was exploited. Those two things, though, are hard to think about in the aggregate. So instead, we're going to represent approximations to them. In place of the exploitable vulnerabilities, we're going to take a look at the fallible agents, which are given access to resources that they might damage, where the fallible agents might be buggy, might be exploitable, or might actually be malicious. And in place of the damage, we'll take a look at the valuable resources that might be damaged. So this looks like the classic access matrix, with the rows being the principals and the columns being the resources that the principals will operate on. Except the classic access matrix is an access matrix of permissions, which principals are directly allowed by the permission system to operate on what resource. And to think about risk, what we really need is an access matrix of authority, which is which principals who can cause what effects, both by the composition of the permission system and interaction with the allowed action of other agents. When time sharing was first invented, it enabled a bunch of different users, to each with their own account, to access a bunch of resources. However, there was no protection. Everyone could mess with everything. Everything was vulnerable to everyone. So the attack surface was complete. Operating systems rapidly discovered the notion of inter-account protection, where Alan could mess with Alan's stuff, Barb could mess with Barb's stuff, Doug could mess with Doug's stuff, and Barb could share some of her stuff with Alan. And the mechanism that created this protection system, the mechanism that separated these accounts from each other, was an operating system and a root account. And because it's the mechanism doing the separation, everything was vulnerable to its mistakes. And that's a pattern that we'll see repeated. Now, having divided up authority this way, we've reduced the attack surface some, but what more can we do to reduce the attack surface? Well, let's zoom in on the box on the lower right, which is Doug messing with Doug's stuff. In classic operating systems, Doug installs a bunch of applications, and those applications run as Doug. Anything Doug is allowed to do, the applications can do. When Doug launches a spreadsheet, it can take his PGP keyring and broadcast it on the internet without there being any security flaw in the operating system. The operating system is designed to allow that. Since then, mobile operating systems now do better than that in the app model. Instead of installing applications that run simply as the user, the different applications are given access to different things, once again, at this level, reducing the attack surface. Now, having reduced the attack surface this much more, what else can we do to reduce the attack surface further? Well, now I'm going to have to step from actual systems that you have experience with to research systems. And in particular, I'm going to focus on capability systems. And the thing to remember about capability systems is capability logic is an abstract logic that can run on many, many different substrates and has been implemented on many different substrates. Just like the emergent properties of chess don't care whether the pieces are made out of wood or aluminum, and digital logic doesn't care whether the gates are transistors or relays. In like fashion, the general logic of capability systems and the kinds of protection it provides can apply across all of these substrates. And since this is a formal methods meets JavaScript meeting, I'll mention that these are the systems on the slide that touch on web languages, either JavaScript or WASM. However, for most of the remainder of the talk, I'm going to be concentrating on an historical system that we built and did a case study on, which is the E fine-grained object capability language that was also a distributed language using a cryptographic capability protocol and a user interface, a capability-oriented user interface on top of it for running these apps called CapDesk. So the picture, so what in the modern world is called apps really corresponds very closely to what we were calling caplets. And this picture is very similar to the previous picture. Different caplets were given what they need. So now we can ask the question, having arrived at this, how can we further reduce the attack surface? And let's focus in on the capmail caplet, the bottom row. Well, capmail, being written in an object capability language, does not need to give every module complete access to all of the resources that are given to capmail as a whole. Rather, the different modules can be structured to get only the parts that they need to have to operate on, and the address book does not need, for example, access to the net or the PGP keyring. And that address book, in turn, being a module written in an object capability language, is made up of a bunch of fine-grained objects, each of which, most of which, can be given very, very tiny authority, so you can reason at object granularity about the attack surface and limiting each component of the attack surface to a very small portion, really making the attack surface at this granularity very, very sparse. And the exports from the module are the module's TCB. At every level, we've seen a TCB that is responsible for the division of authority within that box. And for each level, that TCB is the thing that's given all of the authority by the next outer level that it then uses to subdivide that authority within the box. So we can think of the process that we're illustrating here as the move from defensive programming, where we might hollow out the attack surface in an ad hoc way as the opportunity presents itself, to defense in depth, where we systematically and in a compositional manner hollow out the attack surface at every scale of composition. I'm using the analogy here of a fractal shape called the Menger's sponge. And the Menger's sponge, you reduce at every scale the volume of the sponge by a certain amount. So if you reduce it, let's say, at each scale by a half, the remaining volume is a half times a half times a half, etc., approaching zero total volume as the number of levels increase. However, we cannot get to anything like zero risk. So what limits us from this ideal of the Menger sponge? So let's revisit what we just showed and take a look at the overall mix of strategies we can use to further reduce the attack surface. So we started off with a complete access matrix. Then we reduced the horizontal space within each row by applying the principle of least authority. Alan only needs access to Alan's stuff and the part of Barb's stuff that Barb wants him to operate on. And Alan doesn't need anything else. So his least authority doesn't consist of anything else. So that's principle of least authority at this scale. But then what we saw is recursively going into each of those boxes and applying the same thing in turn. That's the Menger sponge analogy. And we can think of that as that the limit on this recursion is to reduce the density of each box. So we examined the Doug box in detail in the bottom row of the Doug box, which is cap mail. The other light orange boxes here just represent boxes that whose density has been reduced in the same manner, but in a way that we're not examining here. So we assume, for example, that Alan runs CapDesk the way Doug runs CapDesk. So the limits on our reduction on the attack surface so far are represented by the boxes whose density has not been further reduced. And one of them is the TCB at each scale. It has the full horizontal width because it's the thing that's the steward of the authority that it needs to subdivide. So we can't reduce its overall horizontal area. What we can do, though, is reduce its vertical area. This is the place where verification has the greatest leverage. We want to target our verification at the otherwise irreducible hotspots of vulnerability. And the TCB at each level, the operating system at the outer level, the language, and the desktop at the next level down, by applying, by minimizing them, by going to microkernels, simpler languages, and then by applying verification, we can increase our confidence that they're correct, which is to say, to lower the probability of exploitable vulnerabilities that we don't know about. We're still not reducing it to zero. Formal verification is no panacea. It might be that the specification that you're verifying doesn't mean that what you think it means. So, having reduced that, what remains? What's the solid orange boxes that remains? Well, those are legacy. So Alan and Doug, let's say, are both running CapDesk, but Barb is running some legacy operating system and just operating in the normal way. So within the Barb box, there's once again no reduced vulnerability. However, a legacy itself is also not amenable to formal verification. It's just all of this crappy old code, a lot of it in C++, that you never have any hope of verifying. But what you can do is put it in a box and divide it up into multiple boxes, do a separation of powers where Barb takes the different programs that she's running and puts them into separate virtual machines, and then gives each virtual machine only the authority needed for the programs that are running in that virtual machine. So, this legacy issue comes up at every scale because we can't boil the ocean. At every scale of our technology, there's going to be a lot of legacy crap that we simply can't replace or can't replace yet, that we need to figure out how to coexist with. And we need to figure out how to coexist with it while minimizing the danger it poses to us. So altogether, applying these strategies together, we get a multiplicative benefit. We get a multiplicative reduction in risk by adopting practices like the principle of least authority. We reduce horizontal space by applying it recursively across scales. We get the Menger-Sponge effect, which is multiplicative in depth. By minimizing kernels and engaging in both better formal and more reliable informal reasoning, we reduce the height. And then by putting legacy in as small a box, a virtualization box, as we can fit it in, we further reduce the width. And verification issues come up for each of these. For POLA, the issue is minimizing authority, not minimizing permission. Permission is very easy to reason about, but did you actually limit authority to the extent that you thought you did? So capabilities are often expressed using a set of capability patterns, and there's various security patterns that are specific to try to limit the authority propagation. And verifying that those patterns do the authority limitation that they seem to is high leverage, especially when the patterns are widely replicated. With regard to the recursive application, we're talking about embedding one system in another, running an object capability language within a processes of an object capability operating system on machines that are speaking to each other using an object capability protocol. And these embeddings, as was mentioned earlier with the embedding of, for example, WASM into JavaScript, those embeddings themselves can be very, very tricky to formally characterize, even when both the embedded system and the system in which it's embedded to have both been formally characterized. And even though the legacy boxes within the virtualization units are unanalyzable crap, the virtualization mechanism itself would often be amenable to at least more precise reasoning, if not formalization. Nevertheless, it's the real hotspots of concentrated authority that are the places where we should first target expensive verification efforts. So going forward, there's many systems that are worth paying attention to. I've highlighted here not all the systems worth paying attention to, but merely the ones that I'm paying attention to. And to reduce overall systemic risk, it's important to think about system building where you bring multiple of these elements together across different substrates that apply these techniques at different scales. Okay, questions? Wow.
Too difficult after lunch.
What?
It's too difficult after lunch. So yeah, I have one question. So you mentioned blockchain technologies.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go back there.
What do they have to do with...
So blockchains themselves don't have anything particular to do with capabilities, but rather the way to think about a blockchain like Ethereum is that you're changing the TCB risk in a particular, very important way. You're creating a virtual machine where the virtual machine might be flawed, might be a hard thing to reason about. I would say the EVM and Solidity language are very hard to reason about. I'm very glad to see efforts like Dfinity that's trying to port WASM, run WASM replicated on a blockchain. But whether it's EVM or WASM, it still can be thought of as a conventional virtual machine, or in the case of EVM, I think it's better characterized as an operating system. But what you've removed from the risk situation is the supply chain risk, the risk about what the hardware is that it's running on. If I'm running a software on top of a machine, I have to worry, where did I get this machine from? Did Intel already put in the Intel management engine, which is basically a trapdoor that they're openly admitting to? What else is in there? And if I'm running software on somebody else's machine, well, then I have to assume that they might have corrupted their machine. So there's multiple levels of having to trust the hardware, and altogether that's an extremely scary problem. Blockchain systems solve that in an extremely expensive way, which is, multi-way replication and comparing of outputs, where the multi-way might be thousands or 10,000 times, and then those costs are trivial compared to the costs of the mining, if they're still doing mining. But nevertheless, people are doing that because removing the hardware risk from the TCB risk equation can be that valuable for the smart contracts people are running on those platforms. Yeah?
The other answer I would add is there's the blockchain, which is all this hash chain stuff, replication, etc. But then there is the smart contract layer. So Ethereum has a virtual machine that's got an instruction set, it's got a behavior. Some of this technology applied as alternative instruction set behavior as a way to express problems that you really care about security on is what we answer.
Yeah. So Ethereum is a great example because there's been a lot of famous bugs in Ethereum smart contracts. So on the one hand, you've got the smart contracts running on a very, very hard to analyze system, the EVM and Solidity, that's very hard to think about, has many, many ways in which it's hazard prone, but there's no underlying hardware vulnerability because of the massive replication. On the other hand, you have SEL4, which is a beautifully designed minimal microkernel that's been completely formally verified with mechanically checked verification, but it's built in such a way that it runs on some physical piece of hardware that you never know if that hardware is corrupted.
Thank Mark again.